All right, here we are. So I've done quite a bit of work since the last video. I've gone back and I've done a lot of tweaking, adjusting levels, switching out different reverbs and things like that, and really trying to refine the mix down to a place that I want it to. Another one of the big changes that you'll see from the last version is that I've actually gone through and I've done a lot of automating of different parameters, mostly volume and send level, so how much reverb is being applied to different sounds at different times. And a lot of this was to balance out the different sections, so to kind of shift energy about, so that sometimes in some sections something needed to be louder, while in other sections it needed to be quieter, or perhaps how it should evolve over time. And one of those examples is this shaker part right here. If we zoom in at the build here, this shaker gradually is sweeping up, and this is on my send levels to the big reverb, and then also its volume is changing, gets a little bit quieter there in that last section. You can see some other things with the claps are changing. I also ended up putting those claps, kind of doing, I wish that Live would allow multiple grouped tracks to exist inside of one another, so layers of groups. But I can't group a group track, which is what I'm saying here. So the way that I get around that is I'll often use another audio track as kind of a subgroup. So I've got here are those three clap tracks that we had going. Let's collapse down that one EQ8. These three claps going, and I wanted to be able to treat all of those through one group track. So I've gone to each of the claps tracks and switched their audio outputs to a new audio track that I created called, that I renamed to clap. So this is just a regular old audio track here. And I've got their outputs routed to that, so this one has no input that is necessary. And I've set its monitoring to ins, which means that I don't have to record and enable this track in order to hear whatever signals are being routed to this track passing through this track. And then this track passes its audio along to the group track. So each of these three clap tracks first passes through our group track here, the claps track, and then that goes along to what Live thinks of as being the group track, our drums group track. So that's how I've started a submix here. And I did that because I felt like these claps were kind of weak, so I went through and I dropped in some plugins that I really enjoy working with, the Plugin Alliance Mag EQ4, the FabFilter's Saturn, just a saturator, the BX limiter. It's got this really great XL, this saturation knob on there that beefs things up, and then Isotope's imager here to kind of fatten or widen the sound in left to right spectrum. So the claps had sounded like this before. Let's go find a section where they're clapping. So before any of these are turned on. Considerably quieter. And as soon as I add in that EQ, a little bit louder. That really fattens it up in the limiter. And then all of a sudden you'll hear them really open up as soon as I turn on the Isotope's imager. There you can, it's pretty wide there in the left to right. So there's what I did with those claps. Other than that, I switched out some of the reverbs on my return tracks here to give it a little bit bigger sound. I wasn't happy with the way that my other reverbs were sounding, so I switched it out for Native Instruments reverbs on here, the RC48. I think the other one has the RC44 on it. Yep. So those are my two reverbs that I stuck on there. Then I did a little bit of compression, which we're about to talk about in this video, as well as some EQing. I often precede my reverbs with a high pass EQ on it to cut out all the kind of low and low mids. But I find that if there's too much of those in the reverb, that things get muddy really quickly. So I just eliminate it from being passed into the reverb. And you can see here with this one, I've actually got, following the reverb, a mid-side EQ where I sweep out from the mids all the low frequency stuff and leave it all in the sides so that this this reverb is really sitting in the sides rather than in the middle for kind of my bigger, wider sounds. And then I use this smaller reverb, same thing, where I precede it with eliminating some of the lows. Talk about dynamics and compression in a bit, and I pass that into a shorter reverb by the RC24 there, and I leave that one as a stereo, or more so coming down the middle of the mix. So those are my two reverbs, and kind of the work that I did since the last video. So in this video, the focus is going to be on mastering the track. So if mixing has been all about controlling, pulling the track, pulling the sounds apart, or how all these things fit together or don't fit together, and then mastering is all about kind of pulling them together and making them feel more like one track or one cohesive statement. So historically, the mastering engineer has been the person who specialized in preparing your track for distribution on a specific medium or specific mediums. So you had somebody who specialized in prepping your track for vinyl or prepping your track for wax cylinder. Nowadays we have people who prepare or master for iTunes or for 5.1 surround sound, all these different mediums with which you can release your music in nowadays. So mastering is still very much that, but there are some basic tools that can go into that. So what I'm going to give you guys is kind of my basic signal flow or my basic workflow for how I talk or how I address mastering. Just kind of like we had a basic workflow for mixing, I have a basic workflow for mastering as well. So now something to be aware of is, even as my live set is just sitting here looking at the CPU usage in the top right corner there, we can see that without even playing, I'm hovering at about 24-25% usage. So this is going to kind of limit my ability to bring in some high-end plugins to master this track. So it might be beneficial to me to either bounce this out as a stereo track, or if possible, bounce it out as, again, individual stems of each of these tracks and then bring them back in with all of these new effects applied to them and all of my automations and things like that. So that would be one way that I could go through it and save myself. The benefits of keeping everything separate here is that I really find that as soon as I move into mastering, the mix starts to change a little bit. As we start to glue the elements of our track together into being a finished product, you'll find that some things aren't just quite kind of folding in, and we have to go back and re-tailor the mix just a little bit to make things kind of smush together nicely. So having everything still as separate tracks at this point can be really beneficial. Oftentimes, if you're working just as a mastering engineer, you're either going to be getting just the stereo mix, or if you're lucky, perhaps you'll get stems or kind of sub-mixes where you'll get all of your guitars, all of your drums, all of your synths, all in stereo tracks, and you'll have to work with that. But in our cases, since we're wearing all the hats, we're doing all the things, we can give ourselves whatever we want in that process. So I'm going to save myself the time. I think I'll be okay in terms of CPU. I can check and make sure that in my preferences here I've got the highest buffer size possible to make this work, so computer has more time to process everything that we need to do. So we'll just hope, cross our fingers, that we can do this without having to export everything out and bring everything back in. So all of the mastering takes place on the mastering or on the master channel. And the first thing that I put in my signal flow, or that I'm looking at as I step into mastering, is there any problems in terms of the frequency of how things are building up or sliding together in the frequency domain? Is there any problems in there that I need to address? So let's go find an EQ, Instruments EQ8, sorry, Audio Effects EQ8, drag and drop that on there, expand it out so we've got plenty of sight to see there, and let's go to this final break where everything is happening, and let's listen to it. So some of the things I'm noticing is that there's a lot of kind of mid-rangey or high-end stuff that I'm going to try and tailor out, and it can be really useful to just kind of sweep through and listen to what things are happening and then start to pull those out of the way. So let's just grab band number 2 here. Let's turn everybody off. Grab band number 2, and just sweep around and see what all is happening in our mix so far. So hopefully in that sweep you could kind of hear a lot of things that were happening. Right now the spectrum visualizer isn't quite keeping up because of this screen capture application that's running right now. So just bear with some of the visual glitches and focus on what we're hearing. So I'm just going to start to move through this and take care of some of the problems that I hear as I sweep about. So those are kind of some of the problem spots that I'm hearing, that there's a lot of buildup in there. Things are getting a little bit harsh. I'm trying to sweep those out. I could focus some of these up a little bit more and spend a little bit more time with that. That's the general concept. You're just kind of listening through of where am I hearing a little bit too much energy in this spectrum. And the second problems that we can encounter is either too low frequencies or too high frequencies. That you'll find that most playback systems can't handle frequencies much below 40 hertz, and depending on the size of the system and the quality of the system that you're playing this back on, that number will drop or go up if you're listening to it on terrible speakers or something like that. So I've found that pretty universally 30 to 40 hertz is where things really start to drop off unless we've got some great subwoofers that we're working with. So I've just found that in general, going in and doing a really steep high pass filter on the bottom end there, just taking out all the stuff that's dropping off right around that 40 to 30 hertz range and below, will give this mix a better chance at translating well onto other systems. And that is because of just removing things that are going to be inaudible anyways, so why have those be as a part of the mix? The same is true with the top end, that I'll look and see, or listen I should say, and see if there's anything up there that I just can pull out. So let's start with this all the way open, and let's just sweep it down a little bit and see if things sound any better as it starts to come down. I think something right around there. I can't really hear the frequencies disappearing up there, but there's just something about as soon as I just kind of drop right in there, right past that 15, 16,000 hertz there, that all of a sudden it's just like it's softer on my ears. It still has the energy that the track needs, but it's not quite so piercing, and it's just a little bit more musical to my ears. So that's going to be my first EQ, and let's go ahead and rename this as the problems EQ. So just taking care of any problems. Then if I've still got enough dials left or bands left in my EQ, I'll use that same EQ, but for the purposes of just showing them as being kind of separate parts of this process here, I'm going to bring in another EQ8, and this is going to be the one that I'm going to use to define the general character or characteristics of this track. Is this track bright and energetic, or dull and calm, or bass heavy or mid-rangey, what is the character of this track. So let's start with deciding about whether or not it's high energy and bright. So we're going to use a high shelving EQ here. So it could be that, or I'm going to go with something right around there. Then let's look at this low end. Something right around there. Then let's check out the middle. Something right around there, and I'm still hearing this mix and some problems and things like that I'd want to go back and take care of. But it's mostly just some more buildup and things like that. But you're going to find the same, and you're going to continue to tweak things. But let's keep pressing forward here. So there's my general character. I wanted just a little bit more bass end. I wanted to pull out some of the mid range, and then just a little bit of those uppers pushing back into the mix. So that's the first kind of step there, is taking care of any problems and then defining the general character of the track in terms of the frequency domain. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to control the dynamic range of the track through compression. So I won't go into depth into what compression is, but just kind of a general idea here is, first of all, compression is all about dynamic control. So how loud or how soft things are, and what is the distance between the loudest elements of our track and the quietest elements of our track. So if we switch in using one of Ableton's compressors here, we'll switch into the visual or kind of the histogram view down here. And if I mute this out and we just get it playing, we can see that this shows me the dynamics of my track, that this little wobbly line here in mountain range is how loud and how soft is my track right now. And there's already not a whole lot, especially at this moment within the track, there's not a whole lot of dynamic range. There's very limited distance between the peaks and the valleys here. So the first part of compression is we specify the threshold or the volume of the sound that we want to begin to control. And we do that up here by grabbing the threshold value specified in decibels. We bring that down until it's just kissing onto the peaks that we want to start to limit, to kind of smooth out the dynamic range of our track. Then the next element is the ratio, which says when the volume of our track exceeds the threshold, how much is it reduced by? If we've got it set to 2 to 1, that means that however far it exceeds our threshold by, it's going to be reduced by half the distance that it exceeded that threshold. If I want it to be more aggressive, I can increase that ratio. If I want it to be less aggressive, I can decrease that ratio. Then the last two basic parameters for compression is the attack and the release, and that is how quickly, when a sound or when an amplitude exceeds our threshold, does it take for the compressor to reduce that peak by the specified ratio. Quicker attack times will limit more punchy elements or more attack-oriented elements like drums or pianos or something like that, where longer attack times will allow those initial impacts of a sound or initial transients of a sound to pass through uncompressed by the compressor. So kind of a balance between quicker attack times means more kind of like compressed or subdued dynamics, where longer attack times means a little bit punchier, a little bit more open in terms of dynamics. Longer release times means it takes longer for the sound to be uncompressed once it goes back beneath the threshold, and shorter release times means it releases a lot quicker. So balancing between these two can really change the overall character of the track. The last element of a compressor that you should always look out for is what we see here in the top right corner, makeup. If you see makeup or auto gain or anything like that within a compressor, this is typically something that I will switch off. And what this does is, because we're actually going in and we're grabbing the loudest elements of our track and turning them down by the ratio we specify, the makeup gain, so actually we're making the track quieter. What the makeup gain does is we'll actually go back and it will turn up the signal or the sound that's being output from this compressor by the amount that we've reduced the input by. So in a way, we're not actually turning down the volume on the loudest peaks, but rather turning up the volume on the valleys in between those peaks. So that's what compression does, is it kind of decreases that range between the top or the loudest elements of our track and the quietest elements of our track, giving us a more consistent or cohesive sound in terms of the dynamic range. So I'm not going to use this compressor. I'm actually going to use the glue compressor because I think it's got a little bit nicer sound on it. So I'm going to drag and drop that in there. And I'm just going to get this playing and bring this up to a balance that works well. Somewhere right in there. So I'm looking to just be kind of smoothing things out without squashing things. I still want this to feel rather open. So let's go ahead and rename this one as dynamic control. Now each of these stages that I'm talking about has a wealth of knowledge and investigation that we could dive into, but I'm just kind of painting the basic concepts here. So you could kind of isolate each of these steps and go out and research as much as you want for the rest of your lives, honing your skills at each one of these steps. But this is just the basic principles. So we've got problems in character in terms of EQ, controlling the dynamic range. Then the next step is I'll apply some saturation or some excitement to the sound. We'll use Ableton's built-in saturator. So saturation, what it actually is doing is distorting the signal that's passing through it and adding more harmonics above the fundamentals. Or actually, if we had a pure sine tone and we saturated it, we'd hear more than just that fundamental frequency, but rather we'd also hear tones above that as we started to saturate it more and more. So I use the Ableton's built-in saturator in this case, and we just come in and grab the drive knob and start to bring this up. And what I'll find with this is, first of all, you'll notice the track gets louder. But second, I notice that the details of the track, or kind of the level of energy behind the track, starts to kind of build as we increase that drive. So I'll slowly sweep this in. So there's the saturator, and last but not least, we bring in one more EQ. I guess I should say nearly last and certainly not least. One more EQ, and this is again to take care of any problems and define the character of the track after compression and saturation. Because what's happened as we've limited the dynamic range or decreased the dynamic range, we've made things that were quiet before now a little bit louder relative to those peaks before. And then we've also saturated, which has brightened up some of these sounds and brought out more of the details inside of the mix. So some things that we may not have been hearing before now could be popping up after the fact. So let's go ahead and give this a listen. Something right around there. Again, more tweaking to be had, but that's the basic idea. And then now finally, the last thing we'll do is a limiter. And what a limiter does is it's essentially the same thing, and in fact is the same thing as a compressor, in that it's controlling the dynamic range of a track. But rather than having a threshold, we have a ceiling. And the ceiling says you cannot pass this decibel or this level of volume. So it's like a compressor that has its ratio set to infinite, that nothing can exceed this threshold. And what we're actually going to use this for is if I've done a good job in the mixed stage of the game, I should still have plenty of headroom left in the track. So let's go ahead and look at how we're doing here. So I've got just a few decibels of headroom left in the track, and in fact, not much. Let's see, I've got about two and a quarter, essentially 2 decibels of headroom there. So not much left, especially with, I've brought up some bass, I've saturated things a little bit, I've brought out a little bit more of the highs, things like that. So as I've tweaked this track, that headroom that I left open for myself when I first set my initial levels as I started mixing has gradually disappeared as I've really worked things in. And this limiter here is what I'm going to use to bring this volume up, or bring it down in some cases, to the level that this track needs to be for the environment that it's going to be, or the context that it's going to be released within. So if I'm releasing this as a single, I'm going to be looking for having my dynamics be all the way up just under that 0 decibel range. If I'm releasing this on an album or on a mixtape, I might take into consideration what other tracks are going onto this album, and where should this sit in the grand scheme of things. Should it be the loudest track on the album, or the quietest track, or where does it sit within that? So let's assume this is going to be a single, and I'm looking for it to be hitting right at that 0 decibel range. So I'm going to go ahead and start to sneak this gain knob up here. And I could even do this without hearing what's happening there. Just bring it up until I see that it's riding right underneath the 0 decibel range there. And it's not, this bar here will represent the gain reduction that's happening. So if I really boost this, you can see it's really squashing the signal because we boosted too much. We're hitting that ceiling. Let's go ahead and pull this back down until we're maybe hitting it just a little bit. That's okay if we hit it just a little bit, but I don't want to be abusing it. Now let's hear what that sounds like. And then we'd start listening back to our track, go back, do some tweaking, and really kind of settle things in. But that's the general idea of that. Mastering is all about kind of polishing this track off, addressing it as one completed idea, and preparing this for distribution and sharing with our friends and fans. So the first step there was defining the characteristic and taking care of any problems, addressing the dynamic range using some compression, squeezing things or gelling things together using some saturation and some harmonic excitement, addressing any problems in character that, or defining the character that might have changed as we switched up or changed the dynamic range of our track, and finally making sure we're not peaking, and also that we're at the final volume that we want this track to be at. And once we've got all of that, maybe jumping back and listening to and tweaking a few other things, but at some point hopefully sharing what you've got. So that concludes our mixing and mastering workflow and basic concepts. My hope is that this hasn't been the end-all be-all of what you need to know, but rather the foundation for you to go out and now start to investigate each one of these steps, and this workflow just works or provides you with a window into how to do this stuff. So hope you make some good music, and I hope to hear it someday.